Hi everyone, my name's Sam. I've been a cemetery and death historian for over 20 years now, and I know that sounds really morbid, but it's actually really interesting, for me anyway. But yeah, I spent a lot of time working at Abney Park. I was the trust manager there for a while last year, and I was doing prior to that a number of guided tours there. And I think one of the things that I really liked about Abney Park in particular is that it seems to be the most punk rock out of all of the 7 magnificent cemeteries, in the respect that it seems to be the burial place of choice for radicals, rebels, and people who fought the law. Some of them didn't necessarily win, but the people I want to tell you about tonight are a small selection of some of the people who fought for our civil liberties, and they spent time in jail for it. Yeah, the first person who is going to be talked about this evening is a man called William Hone. Has anybody ever heard of him before? No. Oh, good, I'm glad. He's awesome. He was one of my favorite people to talk about because he changed how crime was reported. He was also revolutionary in how print culture was, evolved. And he was also a satirist. So if you think about a Georgian version of somebody like Have I Got News for You, or more recently Jonathan Pye, this was your man. So in order to tell you his story, I'd just like to quickly give you a bit of context. Context, it's my favorite C word in history. Essentially, let me just put it to you this way. There's an associate professor of English at the University of Alabama called Kyle Grimes, who said, William Hone arguably did more than any other writer, printer, or publisher to shape British popular culture in the early decades of the 19th century. So that's high praise indeed. Now, historical context, let's put it this way. At the beginning of the 19th century, the country was ruled by the wealthy elite. You had rich landowners, you had the aristocracy, you had mercantile and banking fat cats who bought their way into the ruling circle, and corruption and nepotism was the order of the day. Democracy was I know what you're thinking. You see, I know what you're thinking here. Is this a documentary about current days, or is it a reflection on the 19th century? And you know the expression that history always repeats itself. This is such a good example of this, such a good example, and I'd love to know what William Hone must have thought about, the current political situation such as it is. Anyway, democracy was a dirty word, and by the 1810s, the government had started getting rather nervous about certain things that had popped up during these times. I mean, the decade had been blighted by wars. They also saw the emergence of trade unions. There was definitely a push for universal suffrage, and they were also very paranoid, the government that is, about the residual fears left over from the French Revolution. God help us if there was rebellion. So the Prince Regent, which would later become George IV, at risk of using this word, he was a bit of a self-indulgent arse. We do have him to thank very much for the Regency architecture. He very much ploughed a lot of money into the arts, so we can't take that away from him. However, he wasn't very popular because he spent lavishly. He treated Queen Caroline like, horrendously, basically, and he didn't offer so much leadership as opposed to focusing on himself, which I suppose most narcissists do. He also wasn't very fond of criticism. Can you imagine that? So just to go back and let's focus on William Hone for a second. He was actually a bookseller by trade. And I think it was when he was at school that he became very familiarized with certain radical organizations, and thus became a radical bookseller and a radical journalist. And he was one of the first people who, I guess you could say, kind of came up with, what is the word I'm looking for, bear with, watchdog journalism, which is something that we still have very much today. I mean, look at dispatches, for example. I suppose you could also look at him as being, brain fog, the genesis of investigative journalism in that respect. So, one example that I could give you was, he invested a lot of time and investigated a lot of time looking into how the inmates of Bedlam were treated, and they were treated appallingly. And when he published his findings, he shocked both the government and the public alike, because people weren't exposed to how people were being treated locked up in this institution. And it was an eye-opening case for everybody involved. And he also published something else in 1815. It was the case of Eliza Fenning, who was a cook who was accused of poisoning her mistress, or her employer. Unfortunately, it didn't get her off the hook for murder, but it was very interesting in terms of him, I suppose, again, an investigative journalist. So 1817 is where it starts getting very interesting, because the government decided to suspend habeas corpus, which was somebody's right to trial, imprisonment without trial, essentially. So they withdrew that. So you could actually be imprisoned without trial. So you can slowly see this beginning of the curtailing and the erosion of people's civil liberties. Again, it sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Depressingly so in some instances. So on a gloomy night in a pub in Chancery Lane, there were 3 gentlemen who sat round plotting the overthrowing of the government. They didn't plan to use any bombs or any kind of violence whatsoever. The 3 men involved were William Hone, George Cruikshank, and William Hazlitt, who was an essayist. So what they planned to do was take down the government using humour. And it got to a point where William Hone was actually arrested. They published 4 pamphlets. I'll tell you the titles of those. The one was the Sinecurist's Creed or Belief, which was an attack on 3 prominent Tories. You also had the late John Wilkes's Catechism, the Political Litany, and the Bullet Te Deum, which was eventually ignored by the authorities, because by the time they got to acquitting him on all of the charges, I think the government were too ashamed to bring up a 4th charge, because they're like, well, what's the point? So let me quickly get to... there we go. So one of the things that he was essentially arrested for was, and you were going to love this, he was arrested on charges of impious blasphemy and seditious libel. He was jailed for 3 months. And the trial was the cause célèbre of the day. Now I'd just like to read this to you, and the reason they got him on impious blasphemy is because he decided to base, it was the Political Litany, on how the Lord's Prayer was written. So for anybody who may not be able to see at the back, it started, O Lord, who art in the treasury, whatsoever be thy name, thy power be prolonged, thy will be done, throughout the empire as it is in each session. Give us our usual sops, and forgive us our occasional absences on divisions, as we promise not to forgive those who divide against thee. Turn us not out of our places, but keep us in the House of Commons, the land of pensions and plenty, and deliver us from the people. Ladies and gents, I strongly recommend, if you have access to the British Library, their website, please sign up, because you can find all of these things. They're wonderfully illustrated by George Cruikshank, who later went on to illustrate for Charles Dickens. But it's absolutely fantastic, cutting satire of the government. Again, I suppose he was the early 19th century version of Mock the Week, or Have I Got News for You, which I'll come back to in a second. Anyway, pamphleting also was a very, very popular means of communicating somebody's ideas or thoughts or political ideals, because it didn't cost very much to do. And it also, for those who maybe weren't so literate, it also, particularly in the case of these particular pamphlets, they were illustrated by George Cruikshank. So he managed to get the best of both worlds there. Now, he was arrested in 1872 for, as I said earlier, impious blasphemy and seditious libel, and he was jailed for 3 months. And these trials were the cause célèbre of the day. In fact, 1,000 people, rushed into Guildhall to watch this particular trial unfold. Now, what he managed to do during this time was he used examples of where other people had taken the mick out of the government and had absolutely no comeback on that. And by the time the trial was over, he was acquitted on all charges. And this relates going back to the Bullet Te Deum, the 4th charge that he was faced with. The government didn't even decide to bring that up, because by this point they realised they were absolutely, they'd been walked over by William Hone. In fact, he induced tears of laughter. It wasn't tears of unhappiness, but apparently he was absolutely fantastically entertaining in defending himself. Now, one of the jurors actually later said, he'd rather been prepared to die rather than pronounce a man guilty who was manifestly prosecuted, not for blasphemy or sedition, but for exposing abuses which were eating into the very heart of the nation. Woo! We need more people like William Hone around now. We really do. Anyway, it was a landmark case for the freedom of the British press. Absolutely landmarked. And it set a precedent in journalism from that point forward. I want to quickly... there we go. This lovely illustration shows him triumphing over the people who tried to oppress him. In fact, he actually later said that the forces of repression were laughed out of court, which is wonderful. Now, he's one of the first stops that I used to include on the tour of Abney Park, because after that he did continue publishing certain pamphlets, etc., about the government, quelle surprise. One later one was 1819. It was called The Political House That Jack Built. And it was based on the nursery rhyme. But again, this is something that I really, really urge you to go and look up on the British Library's website, because it's beautifully illustrated and it's an extreme cutting criticism of the government. And please just go and look at it. It's fantastic. So by the time we got to 1819, has anybody ever heard of the Bloody Code? Okay. So prior to an official sort of police constabulary being established in London, normally people who would dole out justice would be local magistrates of certain areas. And the Bloody Code was a sort of a loose group of offences that one could commit that would result in people being hanged. I mean, you had children being hanged in those days. One particular one that strikes me was being in the company of gypsies for a month or longer. Another one was being caught at the crossroads with a blackened face. I don't know who would do that, but hey, here we are. Another one was stealing rabbits from a rabbit warren. I mean, all of these things would see you swinging from the gallows. And they sound ridiculous, they sound ludicrous, but these things were actually put down, and people would often be hanged for such what we could regard as being seemingly petty charges. I mean, you had the usual suspects of things like forgery, which is where William Hone sort of took up the case. And he published a bill in 1819, which highlighted the harshness of anti-forgery laws. Because, you know, often what would happen is that people who were incredibly poor, as a lot of people were in those days, would often be passed a fake note. And when they got busted for that, they would essentially end up swinging from the gallows for that. And it were people who were struggling. I mean, you have to put yourself into people's positions back in those days. You also had the anti-Sunday laws, that's another thing I can tell you about, where, you know, certain trading wasn't allowed in those days. So people would often work 6 days a week, and the only day they would have off would be Sunday. So they were made to essentially, they were expected to go to church and, you know, do all the things that the day of rest commanded them to do. But that was the only day that left them to go shopping and do things for their homes. And so, you know, basically, in essence, people's hands were tied behind their backs when it came to living regular lives, which I suppose we take very much for granted. So if you got caught for doing any of these things, lo and behold, especially if you had found in the possession of a forged note, they would see you swinging from the gallows. So he published, and I wish I'd included it in this, and I also encourage you all to go and Google image this, William Hone Imitation Forgery Note. He published this beautiful £1 note. By the way, banknotes were huge in those days. Much bigger than what we have now. But essentially the outline of this particular bit of satire was people hanging from the gallows, little skeletons hanging from the gallows, and it had been signed, instead of by the Bank of England, by Jack Kedge, which was the generic name for somebody who went around hanging people. So it was a wonderful, wonderful example of, you know, people being treated unfairly. Anyway, by 1832, you saw the introduction of the Great Reform Act come into play, and I suppose in many instances, by that point, William Hone had actually been vindicated for a lot of the stuff that he'd actually gone to prison for, and, you know, brought to the fore about people's civil liberties being eroded, and, you know, all of the general unfairness that was inflicted upon members of the public. Unfortunately, it was around this time where he got very tired, but also very despondent. And he started suffering from paralytic attacks, which, of course, as you can imagine, as a writer, must have been absolutely awful for him. And he also found religion by that point too. He also gave up he was the sub-editor of a dissenters paper called The Patriot, which was edited by a man called Josiah Condor, who's also buried in Abney Park, coincidentally enough. Anyway, by 1840, unfortunately, he had to quit. And his exact words were, "I am past writing, the hand will not answer to the will." So I'm sure you can understand that must have been devastating for him, absolutely devastating. Now, his last 2 years were spent living in his house in Bruce Castle, which is coincidentally, weirdly enough, where Sebastian was talking about. He lived very, very close by there. And I suppose something else that relates to what you were saying, Amir, about printing culture. Weirdly, all roads seem to lead to William Hone in this particular, you know, session this evening, in terms of how he revolutionised print culture. But apparently on a very dark and rainy day in 1842 in November, he was buried in Abney Park, and he had a number of very, very important people come to visit him at his gravesite for his burial. One included Charles Dickens. So for those of you who do go to Abney Park to see the grave of William Hone, you're standing probably within the vicinity of where Charles Dickens and George Cruikshank themselves both once stood, paying their respects to somebody who had such an... And this is the sad thing, I don't think he realised how much of an impact that he actually had on all of these things. But he was, his legacy was remembered later on in a BBC radio drama called Trial by Laughter, which, shock horror, was narrated by Ian Hislop and Nick Newman. Nick Newman being the satirical Sunday cartoonist, oh God, can I try that again? Sorry. Satirical cartoonist for the Sunday Times and Private Eye. There's also a wonderful book that's been published about him called The Laughter of Triumph by Ben Wilson. So if anybody is actually interested in reading more about him and all of the things that he accomplished, I highly recommend you get this book because it's fabulous and it's incredibly well written. And it's a real lens into all of the things that he accomplished. So, I mean, even his name. I love his name, William Hone. I mean, hone as a verb is to sharpen or make something perfect or completely suitable for its purpose. So I suppose that's a case of nominative determinism if ever I've come across it. But yes, that, ladies and gents, is somebody who I think has made a marked effect. And just looping back to the beginning of the talk, I mean, you know, the number of things that I mentioned to you earlier about how history repeats itself. I do often sit and laugh at his gravesite sometimes, not at him, but what he must have made at the current government, the way things are going. So that's the first person I wanted to tell you about very quickly, who was behind bars for a short period of time for essentially making the world better for the rest of us. So moving swiftly on. Now, if you would forgive me for just a moment, I'd just like to get to my notes about good old Ethel Haslam, because she's fabulous. She's one of my favourite people, again, buried in Abney Park. And this is somebody who walked the walk and talked the talk, and she did not give a monkey's about what happened to her, because she was very much more interested in fighting for civil liberties. So Ethel Clarice Haslam was a suffragette. She was born in Bromley by Bow, and she ended up living, I think her family originally came from Stoke, Newington at some point, because she's buried with her mum and dad. She doesn't actually have an inscription on that particular grave, unfortunately. I don't know why that is. She was cremated and added to the family plot. I love her to bits because, and again, this also loops back to how all of these things happen. You know, I suppose history in a way is kind of like science and chemistry, in that you have, you know, two certain elements and then you have a catalyst that sets off a reaction. And this is exactly the same thing with the ruling class basically owning the country during the 19th century, banking, mercantile fat cats, as I mentioned to you earlier on. And not everybody had the privileges that most rich white men did, and this particularly pertains to the vote. So again, democracy, dirty word. It was essentially viewed as being a mob rule, if a democracy was anyway. And you know, the only voters were those who were involved in the war, who were part of the upper class. So by the time you got to, in fact, the suffragettes, by the way, weren't the first group of people who tried to fight for the vote in the government. For women to get the vote, that is. In fact, 1832, there was a Yorkshire woman, her name was Mary Smith. She and other spinsters petitioned that she should have a voice in the election of members of Parliament. But predictably, she was laughed out of the House of Commons. Again, another attempt to try and secure the vote for women was in 1866, courtesy of John Stuart Mill, the reformer. He actually tried to present a petition to the House of Commons, and guess what? Again, laughed out of town. So by this time, you started seeing groups of women getting together and forming national suffragette unions. So by 1897, you had the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which united 17 societies. They were actually later led by Millicent Fawcett. Now, the NUWSS, they essentially campaigned for peaceful protest. So pamphleting, you know, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, it was all very non-confrontational. But do you want to know what that sort of accomplished? It accomplished nothing. Absolutely nothing. So with that, you saw the formation in 1903 of the Women's Social and Political Union, which was WSPU, which is sort of the more militant arm of the suffragists who'd earlier tried to secure the vote. Now, their campaign sort of a slogan was "Deeds, not words." So they were the first people to essentially go and get really militarized by all of this and actually start doing some pretty things. Some people look back at it now saying, well, is it really worth them burning pieces of art and really worth them doing arson and that kind of stuff? You know, they did what they felt that they had to. Now, going back to Ethel, she's such an interesting woman too, because she fought for social justice for the rest of her life, not just after her fight for women's suffrage ended. So essentially, also another thing I love about her is that I've lost track of how many times she got arrested. Like William Hone was arrested once. She was, at the last count, I think arrested maybe 8 times that I've managed to count. So for the first 5 instances she was arrested, I think the first time was in 1909. It was a WSPU deputation that was sent to the House of Commons. She was arrested but then later released. In the 23rd of July 1910, she went with the WSPU with a procession through Hyde Park. And all of these women got dressed up in these fantastic costumes. I think you'd be delighted to hear that she went as Boudica, or Boudicca. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a picture representing that. The 18th of November 1910, she partook in something that was later referred to as Black Friday. Now, the reason it was called Black Friday is because the police unleashed hideous amounts of basically physical and sexual assault onto the women who were partaking in this particular act of resistance. Winston Churchill, sorry, I'm going to have a bit of a rant here. He has a lot to answer for at this point, because at that time he was the Home Secretary. And he'd actually turned around and I think regarded these women's claims as being, or turned around and openly said, these women's claims of being kicked to the ground, some of which were, I mean, it was on the front cover of the Daily Mail. You can find instances of all of this stuff online. And he turned around and called the suffragettes a bunch of I think their claims came from a mendacious fountain of lies, or something along those lines. I'm I'm paraphrasing here, basically, in short. But so Black Friday, what really annoyed Ethel about this is that it was obviously such a gross abuse of power on these women who hadn't come armed. So she decided to get her own back. And she got 3 or 4 of her friends together, and in Battersea there was an MP by the name of John Burns. Now, John Burns, this is where this gets interesting. He was an MP for Battersea and also the president of the local governmental board that piloted the census bill in 1909. He was viewed by the suffragettes as being a massive hypocrite. Now, I think I found a picture of this, actually. Here we go. Lovely political cartoon. No vote, no census. I think it was famously said, if women don't count, therefore we should not be counted. Within their, fight against not signing the census bill. But you can see him here. He's viewed in 2 different personas. The one where on his knees he's entreating the suffragettes to please sign the census, but then by the same token he's turning around saying, no, you can sign the census, but I'm not giving you the vote. So now you can understand why this really, excuse my language, pissed Ethel off, her and her friends. So they ended up going down to his house and stoning his house in Battersea. Now, apparently not all of their stone-throwing exploits actually hit the target. Apparently Ethel's didn't, but a couple of her friends did. So as a result, she got sent to 14 days in Holloway prison. She was released from that. In fact, the thing I like about her is that she was quite happy to go to prison to make a point. So after that, you had the 1911 census protest, and then 1912 is where she got arrested again. This time, you see, with the suffragettes, they had various means of protesting. Some women refused to pay their taxes, other ones were meeting interrupters, others were arsonists, and in Ethel's case, she was a window smasher. So she ended up going down in March of 1912 to Coventry Street in Piccadilly, and she took her great-grandfather's hammer. And I've read the court case of this. Apparently it was a huge hammer which she concealed in her clothing. And ended up smashing the windows of a jeweller's called Lambert & Co. And of course she got nicked for that and taken down, but by this point she got sent to Holloway prison for, I think it was, 2 months of hard labour. But again, Ethel decided to give a 2-fingered salute to those in charge, and she refused to wear the prison garb. She refused to do what they told her to. What else was there? She refused the hard labour. And also her and her fellow suffragettes also ended up committing an act of mutiny, because by that point I think it was... bear with me, Emmeline Pankhurst, who was incarcerated at the same time in Holloway prison, also known as the Camden Castle. So what they decided to do was Ethel, in protest, turned around and she smashed every one of the 24 windows in her cell. 24 windows, ladies and gents. For this, she was sentenced to force feeding and solitary confinement. She did give a very personal account of what she'd experienced. I'm not going to go into it now because otherwise we'll run out of time. But in essence, she came out of that. She was force-fed. And the horrible thing about her story is that she recalled hearing other women screaming as they got closer and closer and closer to her cell. And it's actually quite distressing to read, but they forced her to drink a pint of this gruel or whatever it may have been. She was never force-fed again, and she was released 2 weeks after that. Now, one of the things that I actually quite like about her too is that her parents gave her full support. So there was another instance where she threw windows at a local shopkeeper's shop and ended up smashing all of that. And her father received loads of postcards that were sent both in person and via the mail, you know, in the letters section, saying, you know, these hysterical women, they need to stop doing this, or we're going to come around and get your windows. So in turn, her father actually responded saying, that's fine, come and get my windows, that's absolutely okay on one condition, that the men who are making these accusations and these threats get exactly the same prison sentences as the ladies. And I was like, oh, Mr. Haslam, I like you. But anyway, she ended up, finally, her last act of defiance, I suppose, was the particularly heinous crime of affixing a WSPU poster to a letterbox. And for that, she was arrested. But her friends ended up paying the bail because they were like, you know, you can't go to prison again. She would have quite happily gone down and served the sentence, because she walked the walk. But for the rest of her life, she ended up doing a lot of social justice campaigns, and she died in 1963, I think at the age of 80-odd years or so. But yeah, she seems by all accounts to have had a very, very interesting life. And again, I mean, this is one of the reasons I like Abney so much, is there are people like her all over the cemetery who actually ended up fighting for social justice. So she spent a lot of time behind bars so that a woman had the right to vote. She was also a crack shot, by the way. After the imagine that. After the WSPU disbanded, she ended up offering her services to the First World War and offered her car to take wounded servicemen out for days out. She offered to actually fight on the front line because she was quite handy with a rifle, as it turns out. So yeah, she didn't mess around, and she put her money where her mouth was. And I think she's one of those people I think deserves a huge amount of respect. How are we doing for time? Oh, okay, cool, thank you. I'll make this very quick, the last one, ladies and gents. Right, finally, I've chosen two women here tonight. Rebecca Jarrett. She was a former prostitute who was rescued by the Salvation Army. Now, she had an incredibly rough life. She was suffered from horrendous alcoholism, and the Salvation Army was formed in 1885. And essentially they went round and they wanted to help people. I mean, they obviously had a very religious sort of, thread running through anything that they did in terms of reform, but she approached them and they essentially saved her from this life of prostitution. Now, something you need to understand back in those days, in the late 19th century, is that there was a huge economic downturn at that point. It was known as the Long Depression. So you can understand why many women felt forced to sell themselves to make money to provide for their families. Yeah, you did get women who voluntarily prostituted themselves because that was their business, but you also had a lot of women who needed to do this because they had families to feed. In fact, some of the records that I've come across showed that women who had regular jobs like milliners and shop assistants would regularly get arrested for turning tricks in order to get money to help feed their children. So anyway, in 1885 there was again, this also links back to investigative journalism. A journalist by the name of W.T. Stead, he published an article called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon in the Pall Mall Gazette. Has anybody ever heard of that before? Okay. And but what this essentially was is an expose into how easy it was to procure a young girl for the instances or for the purposes of prostitution. And what they essentially did, and I mean, you can look at this and look at it with a slightly dodgy eye, which some of W.T. Stead's friends actually did. They decided to prove how easy it was to procure a girl by kidnapping one, as you do. Essentially, they purchased her. Her name was Eliza Armstrong, and they got the Salvation Army involved in all of this too. The idea being that they ultimately wanted to increase the age of consent from 13 to 16, because it was 13 years old back in those days. So yes, essentially they went and ended up buying Eliza Armstrong from her mother. I think initially it was a £2 fee, and then they paid the rest on confirming that her virginity was intact. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, because I'm very acutely aware we're running out of time, Rebecca Jarrett, W.T. Stead, and some of the members of the Salvation Army were essentially arrested and jailed for their involvement in this particular plot. Not plot, that's such a weird word for this context. Sorry, I mean this investigative journalism thing. And W.T. Stead ended up serving 6 months in prison. Sorry, I beg your pardon, 3 months in prison. Rebecca Jarrett ended up serving 6, so double the amount of time, presumably, because she was an ex-prostitute. And of course, I'm sure the jury must have thought, well, she obviously deserved it given her previous history. But essentially, guess what? They did end up increasing the age of consent from 13 to 16 years old, which is still currently as it stands now. So she was responsible for the safeguarding of women in one respect. And I wanted to show you, and I actually owe the Salvation Army a massive thank you for letting me use this picture. This is a picture of Rebecca Jarrett just before she died in the 1920s in an elderly age. But yes, those are three of a large, and I mean a large selection of people who've gone to prison, buried in Abney Park, who essentially fought for our civil liberties and did their bit for, trying to improve the state of the world. So, when you do go around and you do see these people, I think they all, are owed a bit of a nod and a thank you in some respects. But yes, that is it. That is it from me. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me babble away for the past 20-odd minutes. And Amir, I'm going to hand back to you. Oh, we've got questions. Cool. I forgot about that.